All right, today we have John Whitberg with us, and John has a very long history when it comes to being involved in secret space programs and other black projects. Now, we understand that there are a myriad of people who have, if not in the past, very recently, we've seen an influx of folks coming forward with memories that are just now, resurfacing for each of these unfortunate victims or participants, however we want to look at it, considering the different alters that we have created within those projects. Well, what I've just said might sound a little convoluted to you at first, but tonight we're going to get into the depth of what John has experienced and understand some of those terms that we're using in regards to expressing experiences surrounding black projects. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome you, John, to the show. How are you today, man? Thanks for being with us.
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure, brother. So, listen, there are a lot of people that, talk about the origin of memory when it comes to some of these involvement in black projects. Many of them start at a very young age being either abducted in one way or another through human being influence, or we have extraterrestrial influence in certain cases. John, where did your understanding and recollection of your participation in these particular projects originate, and what is your first memory of a particular project that you were involved in?
Well, my very first memory of it never went away, is where I'm 6 years old, laying in bed, and a portal opens in the wall of my bedroom, and this woman in an SS uniform steps through. I'm laying there physically incapable of moving, and I get levitated up out of my bed through this portal into the back of a truck. And I've had some memories all along. I just had no way to explain them until we're coming up on 4 years ago now, in late spring or early summer of 2019.
Well, when you had that experience as a 6-year-old child, was this purely physical, or was there some sort of etheric element to it, maybe being pulled out of your body through certain means? We talk about spirit, we talk about soul, for a lack of better definition. Or was, again, this an entirely physical experience for you?
As far as I could tell, it was completely physical. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What did that, I want to ask you a little bit of details when it comes to an experience like that. Trauma victims very readily remember some of the most acute details of their experience. What did that feel like for you physically? Where was your mind in all of this? I imagine that they may have woken you up, possibly from a sound sleep. What was your thoughts surrounding this as a 6-year-old being taken out of your bed at night?
Terror, but also curiosity, because it had never occurred to me that something like being levitated out of bed through a portal was possible at that age.
Of course.
But I was also absolutely petrified, and yeah.
Now, do you remember where they took you and what you might have done during that first experience?
They took me to Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. Or not Air Force Base, Cheyenne Mountain Complex, rather.
Okay.
And they began the process of MK Ultra, or a more modern variation of it. This was in 2007. So this was post Project Monarch. Mm-hmm. But so it was less traumatic than what some people have spoken about. It was plenty bad enough, don't get me wrong, and from there, after they had created the altars, the first one they took was Heinrich, and we can get into his story later, but mm-hmm. For your audience who might not know what altars are, or what
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Mind fracture is, that's essentially where they, through the use of trauma and various other things, including virtual reality, drugs, hypnosis, mind wiping, etc., they split your mind into fractals, or literally your conscious thought into fractals. And each of those fractals can be programmed to come out when needed and perform tasks.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an idea of possibly how they were extracting and then segmenting parts of your energy and then perhaps able to harness them back in for the reprogramming?
The mind fracturing itself, I know they used a lot of virtual reality trauma, which is a lot cheaper and easier than having a person traumatize you. I don't want to get too graphic, but things like that. And I have seen at one point a cabinet sort of thing where they have, it looks like a computer, sort of, with a whole bunch of hard drives plugged into it, and each hard drive type of thing is where an altar is stored. How they store a piece of human consciousness in a hard drive, I have no idea, but they do have that technology.
You know, I don't even think Preston Nichols, who, you know, obviously had brought this particular concept to the forefront, at least initially, had any idea of how they actually went about this. I mean, he could describe some of the equipment in his time labs that, you know, had a very physical component, could be used as a regular amplifier, transceiver, and so forth. And then he said that every one of those pieces of equipment in his studio was also existing and functioning on the quantum level. And there were times that he was able to demonstrate this to a very small degree, but there's a lot left open for interpretation with that sort of thing. So yeah, as well as I am aware of that type of technology, we still don't understand exactly how it was done, but perhaps as time goes on, some of those memories will resurface, especially in perhaps the operators of some of those machines, you know, at that time. But, you know, again, time will tell. So for the sake of our conversation, let's do something quite important and define for you who they are. So, you know, we say they took us, you know, they're doing this with us. Who is they for you?
There is two main groups. One is the United States intelligence community, and the other is what I call the German breakaway, which is for some very bare bones history for people. The Nazis didn't actually lose World War II. They just retreated to Antarctica, and then they went off planet and formed their own civilization. In 1952, some of these off-planet Nazis came to the United States government and made a treaty that if the U.S. gave them 150,000 kids every year, that they would leave this planet alone. In 2007, I was one of them.
Do you have any idea or insight on the selection process for that? Many times we see or hear about people that have certain abilities. Perhaps in most people they're latent, but for these kids, they had, you know, extraordinary psychic abilities, clairvoyance, you know, perhaps able to heal themselves in various ways. And, you know, for this reason, outside of perhaps blood lineage, they are chosen or selected for these projects. Again, do you have any insight as to why you might have been chosen specifically?
I believe that I am at least the fourth generation in my family from my mother's side to be chosen for this. My mother had dissociative identity disorder, my grandmother does, and her mother before her. So it goes back a long ways in my family. We're all psychic. We all have telepathy. We all can remote view. Whether, even though some of us don't fully understand that's what we're doing, we still do it. And there are connections between my family and and Project Paperclip, and also the intelligence community. in the 40s and 50s. So that lineage, and also because of my telepathic abilities, which are quite extreme, to the point where going out in public is very difficult for me because I hear everyone's thoughts constantly.
Certainly. Do you think that you were aware of at least a certain percentage of your abilities in this respect when you were the age you were being taken for the first time? Or do you think through these projects they've been cultivated to such a degree that now you are familiar with these particular elements?
I've always, for as long as I can remember, going back to age of 2, have been telepathic. But my awareness has gotten much stronger since I've become aware of these projects. So that's my answer to that.
Sure. You mentioned Project Paperclip. For those of you who are not familiar, because I do have a very wide audience that does tune in and listen, very briefly, Project Paperclip brought a bunch of Nazi scientists and medical professionals over to America towards the end of the war and afterwards. And essentially, they were working for us in many different ways. And you can find some of these names if you just do a little bit of research, especially on the Eastern Seaboard. So the majority of these Nazis that came over to America through this particular program actually ended up taking residence down in Long Island. And of course, we understand the connection with Montauk and Camp Hero and so forth. But if you go down into that area, you will find roads named after some of these people that had come from Germany at that time. So with that in mind, we do understand that still a descendant population from those people that came over, and they're very much alive and well here in Long Island today. Where were you physically at that age that you were first taken? Were you over by Long Island, or were you somewhere else in America? Where were you?
I was in Colorado Springs.
Okay.
Within a 15-minute drive of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we also understand, the significance to this is that, Montauk at least was able to, jump back and forth through great distances without any sort of resistance in respect to travel. So they were doing it in some sort of non-physical or non-Newtonian physical way that, again, we're still not familiar with. And understand that, these bases, many of them, or complexes, as you're mentioning, were connected through these different avenues of travel, whatever they may have actually been. I mean, there may be something physical underground, but again, you'd have to be traveling at a very fast speed to be getting to your destination in the blink of an eye, so to speak, especially if you don't feel yourself going through physical travel. Now, very quickly, you mentioned others in your family that have some of these abilities. They're aware of, psychic ability, telepathy, and so forth. I'm wondering if any of them, I don't know how many of your family members you've expressed your experience to, but how many of them do you think would be empathetic or understanding about what you've gone through, perhaps maybe having some sort of experience themselves?
Probably not many. I've talked to my grandfather, and his response was, "I don't know if I can believe this is true, but I also don't think that you're crazy."
Okay.
So, and he does know about some of these things. He worked at a major oil conglomerate for many, many years. One of his uncles was, actually 2 of his uncles were involved in spycraft during and after the war. So, he knows that there's weird shit behind the scenes. Pardon my language, but
no, you're fine.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a lot more than most people get. You know, the folks that have their experiences and don't come from a military family oftentimes have a very difficult time. It's the black projects we talk about quite often. But more recently than not, there has been this explosion of information pertaining to what we would consider to be the secret space program. Now, I have a little story that I would like to relay to you if we have time, but I want to get into this with you to a certain degree because I think out of everything, John, this is what you remember most about in regards to these type of experiences. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. So then in respect to the secret space program, what is it? Who's running this? And how and when did you become involved in this personally?
Well, my involvement began pretty much immediately after that first abduction. What the secret space program is essentially the relation between the breakaway Germans and Earth, is what I like to think of it as, is breakaway German military trafficking humans from Earth to serve in their military as spies, as soldiers, as diplomats like myself, etc., etc. And by now, since the 60s and 70s roughly, there have been corporations involved. There is CIA involvement. There is heavy involvement from the U.S. Navy. Many, many countries are involved. Britain, Russia, China, France, Israel, Brazil, Argentina is a big one, Egypt, etc.
Why do you think the Navy, of all factions, I mean, I understand the Air Force, I understand some of the other more aggressive emergency stock, if you will, when it comes to the military, but if the Navy is involved, do you know to what extent exactly?
Well, the Navy, ask anyone, ask any military person, and the Navy is, and always has been, the biggest and baddest military group in the U.S. They're certainly the most, trying to think of the right word, intellectual. They have heavy involvement in intelligence, not just in combat military. They also are heavily involved in military intelligence, which is a big deal. And things like that.
You know, in certain projects, specifically Montauk, I can start with, we've had people say that they've been to Mars. And I understand that this isn't necessarily in the physical of senses, but somehow they were able to get there, and it was a little bit beyond remote viewing. I think there was something more complex and involved in respect to that process. But one of the things that they had observed was that underground there were these corridors and different tunnels and different systems that obviously had housed at one point some form of life, and within those corridors and halls they found certain artifacts. Now, I'm not going to name exactly what certain things were because I really don't have context in which to do so, because we don't have physical evidence of what they said they discovered. But, I mean, as somebody who has worked within this program, are you aware of anything that was found on Mars that would definitively tell us there was a culture there before, let's say, that the Nazis got there?
Oh, yes. Having been on Mars many times, there are pyramids on Mars. They have found underground. They have found living areas, like some of them still functional living areas that humans just recently moved into. Or recently in the grand scheme of things anyway.
I mean, considering how many individuals, I'll say, are supposedly out there, purportedly, I would figure that they would have to have some sort of accommodation, more modern than not, depending on who's up there. If you've been to Mars and you talk to somebody like Captain Randy Kramer, he'll be the first to tell you that there's an atmosphere on Mars and there's air you can breathe.
Yeah.
What did you find in that experience? Is that true?
Yeah. You shouldn't exert yourself too much. Mars is a lot like Arizona, but colder.
Okay.
In my experience. The air is thin. It's like being in the Himalayas. It's basically just a very cold, dry desert. And
go ahead, sorry.
There is an indigenous ecology, very much an indigenous ecology. Many reptiles, there are some birds, some mammals. There are bodies of water. Not very many bodies of water on the surface, but there are a few even there. There are patches with forests. There's an area with a river flowing through it that's quite heavily forested that the Germans refer to as Neue Rheinland, is a new Rhine. Yes, David Bowie, there is life on Mars.
It's a great song, by the way. Where is some of this evidence for life on Mars? I mean, we understand that there are certain structures that people have talked about. Richard Hoagland brought up these glass tubes that run along certain valleys within the moon. If these people are existing, or any species really, are existing on these immediate celestial bodies, where's the evidence of some of those bases or dwellings or what have you?
Generally underground, but also in the Cydonia region, there is the face on Mars, the infamous face on Mars, where that was clearly artificially made. There are pyramids that are clearly not natural, that you can find pictures of, that are, I believe, in the Valles Marineris region.
Yes, we've certainly seen some of the pictures focused on these structures, that's for sure. Why do you think the United States government or any other government that was in opposition to the Nazis' entire campaign during World War II would have any thought about continuing to work with them in any way, even though they're off planet?
Because they are severely outgunned. They probably would be resisting, and there is still a lot of subterfuge in the intelligence sector of all of this, but they cannot win an all-out war if one were to break out again.
I see. I would be curious to see, or to know, if you will, how they managed to manufacture any arms or munitions out there on Mars, or any other planet for that matter. I think a lot of people mention that complexes, the majority of these complexes, as you've said yourself, are underground. How expansive are some of these institutions, if you have any idea? And if you do, can you describe perhaps what some of these look like? I mean, are you familiar with the materials that may have used to construct these things? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, most of what they built was pre-built, and was... A lot of these places underground were still habitable, and still, they just needed to be refurbished a little bit. The manufacturing is actually not mostly on Mars. Most of it is outside of the solar system entirely.
I mean, I thought that well, at the very most, we had some sort of handle on our immediate universe or immediate galaxy. But you're saying that maybe we're outsourcing materials or this type of manufacturing. How might that have come to be?
Through trade deals. Every centimeter of this galaxy is owned by someone. But of course, these Germans also have to live somewhere. So, wherever they go, they have to strike up deals to, hey, we'll do this and this and this for you if you'll let us set up a colony here. And that's actually kind of my specialty. That's what they use me the most for, is I'm the telepath on the ship who talks to the aliens and gets what we need.
Well, I'd certainly like to hear a little bit about that, and of course, who it is you might be interacting with in respect to these different species.
Okay. Well, the process is that the Germans have a remote viewing device that many people would refer to as a looking glass.
Like the chronovisor?
Yes.
Okay.
That they can scan planets with. They find one that is habitable and that is either very strong politically or very weak politically. Because that's when they'll be the most likely to accept new inhabitants. And then, essentially, they send out a ship. We go there, land on the planet, we approach whomever the authority is, and we begin the negotiation process.
Okay. Are there treaties signed, contracts in between parties? Is there something physical on paper, so to speak, or an oral agreement? What does that look like?
There is usually, yes. And there's usually some sort of a personnel exchange, too, for insurance purposes, like, if our people come to no harm, yours won't either.
Okay. Some sort of peace agreement.
Yeah.
So how is it that all of this is going on right under our noses? How do we not see any tangible evidence of this in the skies? I mean, I want to tell you that I've seen many videos where people have captured objects simply floating in front of the moon, some of them flying out of craters or landing within. We see outcroppings of what appear to be some sort of antenna on the moon itself. How is it that we're not more aware of any of this activity, especially on the large scale that it seems to encompass?
Good question. Because most of it just isn't happening close enough for us to see it. Less and less of it is even happening on the moon and Mars as telescopes get better and things like that. And people like me who get used, we're not supposed to remember.
Of course.
And in fact, I'm considered a semi-defective product because I do remember so much.
To the best of your recollection, what is the process that you underwent wherein they erased your memory or pushed whatever memory was being targeted deep within the layers of your subconscious?
Well, that's the purpose of creating alters or fractals. Is the alter stores the memory of what they have and haven't done. The main person is not supposed to get it. So, essentially, it's a different person who is using your body to do these things.
And yet you share memories.
Yes.
And essentially what you're saying is that once your memories are extracted from you the way they are, they're then imposed on this alter. And if one were to merge back with this alter, by that definition, you should have the memories return as well, right?
Correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about the process of how you integrated some of your own alters and the effort or endeavors that went into actually recovering some of those memories that perhaps had sat with them for so long?
Two of the ones I've integrated were... One of them actually forced his way back in because he died and the soul fragment just came back to the original, which is what happens naturally. And another one, he has been deintegrated, but he did rehome for 3 days because he died. And for whatever reason, they could not resurrect him for 3 days. And there's one I'm working on now on very slowly integrating. Because he's quite dangerous, but he actually does operations predominantly on Earth, actually, for naval intelligence, and he's extremely dangerous, and I'm slowly integrating him.
You know, again, when we talk to certain people who have, claims to be involved with SSP, Emery Smith certainly comes to mind. I've had people tell me that he was definitely there. We all know about Corey Good. I mentioned Captain Randy Kramer earlier. All three of these people talk about some sort of regenerative process that they could go through if they passed away during battle on Mars specifically. And they had mentioned that there is a hub of sort in way of how they look at the moon, and they have actual physical bodies, clones of themselves, that they were able to then switch their consciousness into, again, either if they passed away during battle or if they had spent an exorbitant time on Mars and came back aged 20, 30, 40 years, they could hop back into this younger body, to the point where Captain Randy Kramer claims that he's not in his original body whatsoever. Do you have any experience with that particular process, or have you heard anything about it? How much do you know?
I know a little about cloning. That's actually more of an American thing. The Germans, which are where they're most of who uses me, they use your original body. They have... Mm-hmm. It's part of their spiritual system, which I still don't fully understand, but they have a really big thing in their spiritual system about purity and whatnot, and they...
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. So, unless they absolutely have to use a clone, they only use your original body. The regenerative process for that is there are nanobots that can regenerate cells. They'll put you into a tank full of nanobots that will go in and regenerate whatever cells need to be done. Then they'll do like a shock to your heart or whatever is necessary to bring you back to life. And there's usually at least one, we call them regen tanks, there's usually at least one on every ship. And every base has them. Even some private individuals, the very wealthy in their civilization, have them.
In Montauk, with the fracturing of the mind. So, again, people who, in some of these other projects, and were sent back to Montauk or into the SSP, and found something quite similar. Have you been to any?
Have I been to what? I'm sorry.
Sorry, hang on there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Have you been to any other planet besides Mars and spent a considerable amount of time there?
Oh yes, many. I was taken and raised on Vega Prime, which is in the Vega star system, which is, I think it's around 60 light years. I've spent time on Centurion, which is in Alpha Centauri. It's a jungle planet in Alpha Centauri that is, to my recollection, is actually the capital planet of the German breakaway.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, how many of these planets do they have under their thumb?
The number that I learned, the most recent one, which was this past summer, that I had recall of, was around 10,000.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people, at the very least.
It is. Their population is in the trillions, and that's all because they keep going further and further into the past to establish their civilization, further and further and further back.
I see.
And so, more and more generations of them are kind of just appearing.
This is, I mean, if what you're saying is accurate as I think it is, this is very concerning. If for no other reason than the Nazis always wanted to change history. And we know that, it's documented the way that they would erase certain things, take artwork and what have you, just, to fit their own narrative of what they were, trying to propose. So, again, if we look at some of what the Nazis have done and we give them the capability of time travel, well, I mean, it couldn't be in worse hands. This type of technology was something that I think many of us were aware of in much more ancient times. Whether it was executed the same way, I can't say for sure, but we do understand that groups like the Illuminati and others that are on a parallel plane have made it their jobs, again, in more of ancient times, to hide some of this information from us, as they knew the consciousness overall on the planet at the time dipping downwards, which we see happen. And of course, it spikes back up. You look at the Yuga cycle, and it's 26,000 years and some change, and you go through the whole cycle. So, do you think that... Well, this might be a very evident and obvious answer, but do you think that we are, with the technology that we have gained, using it properly in any way, shape, or form? Because we understand the power behind it, but then you talk about, how the Nazis are so proliferant out in space, utilizing possibly this technology to their great advantage. Should we have any of this knowledge right now?
No. It pains me to say it, but no. I don't think...
Yeah, go ahead.
To be honest, I think time travel in general is a bad idea for any civilization.
Why?
Look, because sooner or later, the worst element is in your society will get a hold of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee any immediate future that we might be responsible enough to hold something like this? And if we are, what might we do with it exactly?
I would hope we would fix some of our mistakes. Maybe, stop genocides and some things like that. But to be honest, there would need to be some sort of a very strict legal system with very strict civilian oversight over what could and could not be done using this technology. And I think maybe some of us could handle it. I mean, it's been a part of our fiction for quite a long time, so people do have at least something of an understanding of how this technology would work, even if they don't think it's real.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we probably need at least another 25 years before our collective psyche will have advanced enough to be able to handle this.
Okay. That's somewhat promising, to have some sort of thought in respect to timeline. But of course, everything is up to us in how we act and react based on what we've done already. It's not a matter of just forging ahead for humanity. It's a matter of, cleaning up that wake that we leave behind us and have left us for so long that was more destructive than it was creative. And of course, when we talk about some of these projects and endeavors, we can include those in the mix as well, because the devastation that has occurred on certain levels within these projects is absolutely unfathomable to your average person. And even those who have been a part of it still have a difficult time wrapping their heads around it. And of course, this is, I think, par for the course when it comes to, some of these larger, endeavors that people have undertaken, of course, right under our nose. Now, with a population going into the trillions, okay, we look at Earth and we understand our biological system here, we understand our environments to certain degrees, and we have always fought, from the best of my knowledge, we've always fought with disease. From your experiences out in space on these other planets, have you witnessed any form of pandemic or epidemic when it comes to human health or other health systems on the planet in respect to the beings that may be there?
Yes. I have. Mm-hmm. With these regeneration tanks, they're not too terrible, usually. Although, in some circumstances, such as in poorer colonies, where the people at the top don't really care whether anyone lives or dies, then it can be devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And there are space diseases are a thing, by the way.
I haven't heard of it.
They're very much a thing. There are parasites out there that will literally eat you from the inside out.
Okay.
There are things that strongly resemble what we would consider like zombie viruses.
Mm-hmm.
And humans are often susceptible to them. And we also spread them when we move from one planet to another. And spread them to other civilizations who have no idea what to do.
Gee, history so often repeats itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, unfortunately.
Well, you were still confined within this bubble of perception. Maybe we can just call it the third dimension. And within that duality, I think that there are very few who have escaped the clutches of such a system. But in doing so, they actually kind of put themselves into a completely different state of vibration altogether, whether it's higher or lower, whatever you want to look at it as. And as a result, aren't affected by that certain duality. But we're talking about, an existence that we can only surmise what the existence of would be like. We can only guess and use speculation, because I don't know anybody who's experienced that on a long-term sense to say definitively, we can quantify this and measure it at the very least.